going to be very much supported by people in Auckland.
Speaker.
I call Andrew Bailey.
Mr Speaker, it's a pleasure to be talking on the Land Transport Management Regional Fuel Tax Amendment Bill. And particularly just to listen to that previous speaker who I heard was an expert in transport matters. Something I never heard before, Mr Speaker. However, she did make the point that we all have to go back to our Auckland constituencies, and of course I am an Auckland MP, and tell them about this issue, and tell them why we're not supporting this bill, Mr Speaker. And so I was just looking at the public opinion results, Mr Speaker. So back in May, we had the One News Colmar Brunton poll, 58% opposed. Another one in May, final consultation on draft proposal on regional fuel tax. Auckland Council, 51% did not support. May Auckland Council Facebook, 74% against. May Select Committee, 89% of the 500 submissions opposed. April, 10-year budget plan, 48% opposed. And the Colmar Brunton poll, another one, in April, 52% opposed. So, Mr Speaker, I'm going to talk about my electorate soon, because I can assure you that many of my constituents are very unhappy with this bill. And, Mr Speaker, I think we have to ask ourselves, why is the government pursuing this agenda? And as we all know, the national government worked closely with Auckland Council to develop a $28 billion plan over the next 30 years to deal with a scheduled plan, well-considered transport plan for the Auckland area. And, of course, that was called the Auckland Transport Alignment Project, or what people refer to as ATAP. Now, out of that $28 billion, all of it was funded except for $4 billion. And when you talk about $4 billion, it sounds like a lot over 10 years. But in fact, Mr Speaker, every time you talk about a brand new motorway, it's basically $1 billion. So, in context, Mill Road, which the national government committed to just before the election, is $1 billion project if it was to be done. So actually the essence about what the regional fuel tax is about making up that shortfall of the $4 billion over 10 years. And of course, we have tried regional fuel taxes before, and they have shown to be not a great mechanism. In fact, the last time they were tried was back in 1990. And of course, where we were trying to go as a former government was actually to look at congestion pricing. And I think there's a great deal of support for congestion pricing in Auckland, and I've been in many seminars, and as a government we were trying to do it, and I know the Deputy Mayor and a number of councillors and people from Auckland Transport went to places like Singapore and looked at congestion pricing. Now, the issue with congestion pricing, of course, was that it's going to take a little while to implement, but we have heard from many of the submitters that this should be the key priority if you are to put in this type of funding. And the emphasis and the incentive to put in congestion pricing should be of paramount concern. The third option that the government may have considered was charging at Marsden Point, which one of the submitters, Mr Ken Shirley, made a very good submission, the very first one we heard in Auckland, which is if you're going to charge a fuel tax, make it easy, do it at Marsden Point. Really easy. Or the fourth option was you could have put pressure on Auckland Council. And as we all know, Auckland Council costs have gone up dramatically over the years since it got formed. And, of course, this regional fuel tax puts no further pressure on the council to do that. The fifth option was for the government to take over the funding of key projects. And, of course, that's where the central government was under national going. Increasingly, we were looking at major roads in Auckland where we would take it over as a government, which gave us the advantage of being able to consent them in a short time period of up to 6 or 9 months, depending on their priority, and actually get them built. Rather than talk about getting council to work through their own processes. And that, Mr Speaker, in my view, was the most important option that should have been considered in terms of this, looking at this issue. But what did we end up with, Mr Speaker? We ended up with this fuel tax proposal, which is collected at the distribution level, which means if fuel is imported at Tauranga, as an example, it is a distribution company that then accounts for it, and that fuel may end up in a petrol station, it may end up in a farmer's tank. And consequently, it is quite complicated. The second thing is we've now ended up with two fuel taxes, which I think the government hasn't really been that clear about. We've got the 11.5 cents that this Auckland fuel tax will generate, on top of the new tax of 12.5 cents on the fuel tax increase that has been implemented by this new government, making a total of 25.3 cents per litre, that every time you go to the pump in Auckland, you will be paying on average, depending on the size of your car, about $15 extra per tank load. And Mr. Speaker, I put it to you that this is quite a significant cost. $15 every time you fill up the tank. The third thing we've ended up with is a bill that promotes a 10-year window with a right to the council to actually extend it beyond that. So if you were saying let's have the incentive to put in place a much more fairer system around congestion pricing, you wouldn't put a 10-year time frame, and a number of the submitters suggested that we should put in a much shorter time frame. But of course that was overruled, and we've actually made it even more permissive in the sense that Auckland Council, prior to the end of the 10-year period, do a review and it can be extended. And of course, in the Act, which wasn't what was partly talked about in the election, but has now been incorporated in the bill, is it expands this legislation to all other regions. So, of course, we had Hamilton City Council turn up in Auckland, and they were saying, yes, we want to do it too, Mr. Speaker. When we asked them how much that would raise, they said $15 million a year. $15 million a year. And then we had a whole raft of other councils talking to us about raising money. And, of course, this is going to proliferate around New Zealand. And so we ended up hearing receiving 520 submissions, and 20 of which we heard. And to be honest, Mr. Speaker, I have been a member of the Finance and Expenditure Committee now for 5 years, and I found it quite embarrassing to listen to the submitters coming in, thrashing the committee about this bill. And of particular concern to my electorate in Hanua, south of Auckland, farming and large horticulture industry, we had one of the submitters in the horticulture of New Zealand come and talk about the implications this will mean for the many, many horticulturalists who drive their tractors and trucks and loaders and forehoists in their factories, large number of equipment, all running on diesel power, and now will be caught under these arrangements. We talked about a dispensation, but of course that was overruled, Mr. Speaker. And I think it adds an incredible amount of complication to an industry that is incredibly productive and helpful to the New Zealand economy. The second thing we heard about, and we're already seeing the impacts of, is price spreading. And this occurred in 1990 when fuel tax was in place. And we are now seeing that, and we talked about, the boundary of Auckland stops at basically Bombay and cuts down through my electorate. On the other side of Pocono, we had a number of the fuel companies turning up, talking about the issue of price spreading, and of course we now have seen that in evidence happening. But the worst thing about this bill, Mr. Speaker, in my mind, is the regressive nature of this bill and how it will hurt the poorer members of New Zealand. And I know that the Labor government like to say, well, our tax proposals are going to deal with them. But unfortunately, their tax proposals that they ripped off average New Zealanders were being directed to those families with children. And what does it mean for young children or young adults who are going to university? What does it mean with those couple that don't yet have children but are busy buying for their house? And what does it mean for the superannuitants who are out there driving around, going to their bowling club, all that sort of stuff? All those categories are not going to have any benefit by the tax reforms that this Labor government has put through. And what it's going to mean is that these guys will be paying $15 every time they load up or fill up their car. And I think that is the worst aspect of it. And so in my area, I just want to deal with this issue around Mill Road. the minister keeps saying we're going to deliver, or he's going to deliver Mill Road. Well, let me be clear. I've spent, since this announcement has been made, trying to educate my constituency because they've been, in my view, misled to the extent that they believe that they are getting the entire Mill Road $1 billion project that Honourable Judith Collins and I were successful in getting the National Party to commit to. They are not. They're only going to get the first stage, Redoubt Road, which will stop our Alphaston School. It will be a road to nowhere, Mr Speaker, a road to nowhere. It does nothing for my constituency.
Order. Speaker. This is a split call, 5 minutes. I call Dr. Duncan Webb. Order.
Tēnā koe, te mana whakawa.